The fluorescent lights of Miller's diner flickered to life at 5:47 a.m., casting their harsh glow across the cracked vinyl booths and scratched linoleum floor. Sarah Mitchell tied her apron strings for what felt like the 1,000th time in her 3 years working the morning shift, her fingers moving through the motion with the kind of muscle memory that comes from pure survival. The coffee machine gurgled to life behind her, that familiar sound that meant another day, another chance to scrape together enough tips to keep the lights on in her tiny apartment across town. She was 28 years old and felt 40, the weight of unpaid medical bills and her mother's deteriorating condition pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing she carried everywhere. The diner smelled like grease and yesterday's burnt coffee, but it was hers in a way, this little corner of the world where she knew every regular's order by heart and could pour coffee with her eyes closed. Outside, the city was just beginning to wake up, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as early commuters made their way to jobs that probably paid better than hers ever would. Sarah checked her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser, pushing a strand of dark hair back into her ponytail, noticing the new lines around her eyes that hadn't been there last year. Her manager, Pete, was already in the back doing inventory, his gravelly voice counting boxes of frozen hash browns with the enthusiasm of a man who'd given up on dreams a long time ago. The first customer wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes, and Sarah used that time to prep her station, filling sugar dispensers and making sure every ketchup bottle was topped off. These small rituals that gave her something to focus on besides the mounting pressure of bills she couldn't pay. Her phone sat heavy in her apron pocket. The screen cracked from when she'd dropped it last month, and she knew if she checked it she'd see 3 more messages from the hospital billing department, each one more urgent than the last. Her mother's chemotherapy wasn't covered by the insurance they could barely afford, and the debt was climbing faster than Sarah could run from it. She'd started picking up double shifts, working herself to exhaustion, but it never seemed like enough. The bell above the door chimed, snapping her out of her thoughts, and she looked up to see old Mr. Henderson shuffling in for his usual black coffee and wheat toast. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," she called out, already reaching for a mug, her voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness that all good waitresses master, the kind that hides everything underneath. He grunted in response, settling into his usual booth by the window, and Sarah poured his coffee with steady hands, even though inside she was calculating how many more shifts she'd need to cover just this week's portion of her mother's treatment. The morning routine continued, one customer after another, faces she recognized and faces she didn't, all of them needing something from her. More coffee, extra napkins, a smile they didn't have to pay for. By 8 o'clock the diner was in full swing, the breakfast rush hitting like it always did, and Sarah moved through it all, with mechanical precision, her body on autopilot, while her mind stayed trapped in the endless loop of worry that had become her constant companion. At 9:15 a.m. the bell chimed again, but this time Sarah looked up to see someone who clearly didn't belong in Miller's diner. The man who walked through the door wore a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, tailored so perfectly it seemed to move with him like a second skin. His silver hair was swept back in a style that spoke of expensive barbers and careful maintenance, and when he glanced around the diner his eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in every detail with the kind of attention that made Sarah instinctively straighten her posture. He was probably in his early 60s, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world, that particular brand of self-assurance that only comes from real power. The other customers noticed him too, conversations dropping off mid-sentence as they watched this clearly wealthy man navigate toward the counter, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum in a way that seemed almost obscene in this setting. Sarah grabbed a menu and approached him, her customer service smile firmly in place despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Good morning, sir. Sit anywhere you'd like." He chose a booth in the corner away from the windows and settled in with the careful movements of someone used to being watched. Up close, Sarah could see the details that marked him as truly wealthy, the platinum cufflinks, the watch that she recognized from a magazine as something that cost more than a car, the way his manicured hands rested on the table with casual elegance. "What can I get started for you?" she asked, pen poised over her order pad, already preparing herself for some complicated off-menu request that rich people always seem to think diners could accommodate. But he surprised her. "Just coffee. Black." And your honest opinion about something. His voice was smooth, cultured, with the faintest hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. Sarah blinked, thrown off her script. My honest opinion? I'm considering a business investment in this neighborhood, he said, gesturing vaguely at the window. I want to know what someone who actually lives and works here thinks about it, not what my consultants tell me, not what the market research says. Real perspective from a real person. Sarah hesitated, her hand tightening around her pen. In her experience, when rich people asked for your opinion, they didn't actually want to hear it. They wanted you to tell them they were right. But something in his expression seemed genuine, a tiredness around his eyes that suggested he was as weary of corporate doublespeak as she was of pretending everything was fine. I'll get your coffee first, she said, buying herself time to think. When she returned with the steaming mug, he was looking at his phone, his expression unreadable. She set the coffee down carefully, and he looked up at her with those sharp eyes. So, he prompted. Sarah glanced around the diner, at Pete in the back, at the other customers who weren't paying attention anymore. Honestly, this neighborhood doesn't need another luxury development or high-end retail space. It needs affordable housing. It needs a clinic that actually accepts Medicaid. It needs a grocery store that sells fresh vegetables instead of just processed food. But I'm guessing that's not the kind of investment you're talking about. For a moment, she was terrified she'd overstepped, that he'd complain to Pete and she'd lose the job she couldn't afford to lose. But instead, the man smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. No, he admitted, it's not, but perhaps it should be. The man introduced himself as Marcus, though he didn't offer a last name, and for the next 20 minutes, he asked Sarah questions about the neighborhood that no consultant would ever think to ask. What time did the bus stop running? Where did families shop for school supplies? Which streets felt safe at night, and which ones didn't? Sarah found herself answering honestly, maybe more honestly than she'd intended, because there was something in the way he listened, actually listened, that made her forget about the gulf between their worlds. He took notes on his phone, nodding occasionally, asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand the texture of life in a place he'd probably never lived anywhere close to. Other customers came and went, and Sarah split her attention between Marcus and her other tables, refilling his coffee twice while he continued to probe deeper into the reality of living paycheck to paycheck in a city that seemed designed to crush anyone without a safety net. Finally, he leaned back in his booth and regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're smart, he said bluntly, articulate, observant. What are you doing working here? The question stung more than it should have, probably because Sarah had asked herself the same thing about 1,000 times. Paying bills, she said simply, same as everyone else. But you could do more with the right opportunity, the right backing. Opportunities cost money. Sarah cut him off, more sharply than she'd intended. Education costs money, time costs money. And when you're spending 16 hours a day just trying to stay afloat, there's no bandwidth left for opportunity. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flash of what might have been respect or approval. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick and cream-colored, expensive paper that practically announced its contents. He slid it across the table toward her. There's $20,000 in here, cash. Sarah's hand froze halfway to picking up the coffee pot, her heart stuttered in her chest, and for a moment, the noise of the diner faded to nothing. $20,000, that would cover her mother's treatment for the next 3 months, that would catch up the rent. That would buy her breathing room she hadn't had in years. I can't, she started, but Marcus held up a hand. Here's what I want in return. Tomorrow morning, there's a city council meeting about a rezoning proposal for the industrial district. I need you to speak at that meeting. I need you to tell them exactly what you told me, that this neighborhood needs affordable housing and services, not luxury development. My company is bidding on that contract, and if it goes through, it'll displace about 300 families. I need someone with your authenticity to help block it. Sarah stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. She could see the edge of the bills inside, crisp and green and promising everything she desperately needed, but something about this didn't sit right. You want to pay me to speak against your own company? I want to pay you to tell the truth. It serves my purposes, yes, but it's also the right thing to do. Consider it a win-win. Sarah picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. imagining what that money could mean. Then she looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw what he was offering, not just money, but a compromise of her integrity, a transaction that would turn her genuine beliefs into a commodity he'd purchased. "No," she said, and slid the envelope back across the table. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise crossing his features for the first time since he'd walked into the diner. In the background, the coffee machine hissed and Pete called out an order, but Sarah's entire focus was on the envelope sitting between them and the choice she'd just made. "No," Marcus repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "You're turning down $20,000. "I'm turning down being bought," Sarah corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. "If I speak at that city council meeting, it'll be because I believe in what I'm saying, not because someone paid me to say it. The moment I take your money, my voice stops being mine, it becomes yours. And I've spent my whole life being told what to do and how to think, by people with more money and power than me. I'm not adding you to that list." She could see him processing this, his sharp business mind trying to find the angle, the leverage, the way to turn this conversation back in his direction. But Sarah had made her decision, and there was a strange kind of freedom in it, even though she knew she'd just walked away from the solution to all her immediate problems. "You need that money," Marcus said, not unkindly. "I can see it in the way you're wearing that uniform. It's been mended 3 times at least. I can see it in the way you checked your phone during our conversation, the panic in your eyes when you read whatever message came through. You're drowning in debt, probably medical given your age, and the current healthcare crisis. $20,000 would change your life." "You're right," Sarah admitted, and saying it out loud hurt more than she'd expected. "I do need it, desperate. But I need to look at myself in the mirror more. My mother is sick, she's dying, actually, and the bills are crushing me. But she taught me that there are some things you don't compromise on, and your integrity is one of them. She'd be more disappointed in me for taking your money than she'd be proud of me for keeping her alive a few more months with blood money." Marcus leaned back, studying her with those sharp eyes, and Sarah got the distinct impression she was being evaluated in a way that had nothing to do with Waitress. The envelope still sat on the table between them, obscene in its promise, and she had to physically resist the urge to grab it and run. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the coffee pot again, needing something to do with them. "I'll speak at that meeting anyway," she continued, "because you were right. This neighborhood does need affordable housing. It needs a clinic and a grocery store, and all the things that actually help people instead of just displacing them. But I'll speak because it's true, not because you paid me to say it. There's a difference." For a long moment Marcus said nothing, then he reached into his jacket again, and Sarah felt her stomach drop, expecting him to pull out another envelope, a bigger offer, the kind of money that would be truly impossible to refuse. But instead he pulled out a business card, simple and elegant, with just a name and a phone number embossed in gold lettering. "Marcus Holloway," he said, finally offering his full name, "CEO of Holloway Industries. And you just passed a test that 99% of people fail." Sarah took the card, confused now, her certainty wavering. "A test. I own the diner," Marcus said simply, and the world tilted sideways. Sarah's brain stuttered, trying to process what he'd just said. The coffee pot nearly slipped from her hand, and she had to concentrate to set it down on the table without spilling. "You are—" "I own Miller's Diner. Have for about 6 months now. I own 73 establishments like this across the country. Diners, small restaurants, the kind of places that are barely hanging on in the current economy. I buy them, stabilize them, and try to figure out how to make them sustainable without destroying what makes them valuable to their communities." Marcus gestured around the worn interior, his expression almost fond. "I also own Holloway Industries, which is currently worth about $18 billion, give or take." 18 billion. The number was so large it stopped meaning anything, just became abstract noise in Sarah's head. She sank into the booth across from him without being invited, her legs suddenly unable to hold her up. "The rezoning meeting is real," Marcus continued. "The proposal is real. What I told you about my company bidding on the contract was a lie. I already own the land, and I've been trying to decide what to do with it. The test was real too. I do this sometimes, come into one of my establishments anonymously, talk to employees, see who they really are when they think I'm just another customer, see who has integrity and who doesn't. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to recontextualize everything that had just happened. The questions about the neighborhood, the envelope of money, his interest in her opinions, it had all been calculated, a setup designed to test her character. She should have been angry, probably, but mostly she just felt exhausted and confused. Why? She managed to ask. Why test people like that? Because integrity can't be taught, but it can be compensated. I spend most of my time surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear, will compromise any principle for the right price. It's exhausting and it's dangerous. When I find someone who won't be bought, who actually believes in something more than their own advancement, I pay attention. He picked up the envelope and held it out to her again. This isn't a bribe anymore. It's a bonus for being exactly the kind of person I need in my organization. Sarah stared at the envelope, then at Marcus, then back at the envelope. I don't understand what's happening right now. I'm offering you a job. Not as a waitress, as a community liaison for Holloway Industries. Your job would be to do exactly what you did this morning. Tell me the truth about what communities actually need, instead of what corporate consultants think they need. You'd work directly with my development team to ensure that our projects serve the people who live in them, not just the shareholders who profit from them. Starting salary is $200,000 a year, full benefits, and that envelope is your signing bonus. $200,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. That was more money than she'd made in the last 5 years combined. That was her mother's treatment covered. That was breathing room. That was a future that didn't involve working herself to death for tips that barely covered rent. But the test, the manipulation, the way he'd orchestrated all of this, it left a bad taste in her mouth. How do I know this isn't another test? She asked. How do I know you won't pull the rug out the moment I say yes? Marcus smiled, that same real smile from earlier. You don't. You have to trust me. Which is ironic, considering I just demonstrated that I'm willing to manipulate people to get what I want. But I can give you references, contracts, proof of employment for the other people I've hired this way, and you can take time to think about it. The offer stands for 72 hours. Sarah's shift ended at 2 in the afternoon, but she stayed late, sitting in that same corner booth while Pete cleaned up around her. He knew something was up. She'd been distracted all day, barely able to focus on orders, moving through the routine like a ghost. Marcus had left hours ago, after she'd told him she needed time to think, but his business card and that envelope sat in her apron pocket like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She'd tried to work, tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of the job, but her mind kept circling back to the same impossible choice. Pete finally came over, sliding into the booth across from her with a grunt. He was 56. Had managed this diner for 20 years before the ownership changed hands 6 months ago, and had the kind of world-weary wisdom that came from seeing every kind of human drama play out over plates of eggs and hash browns. You gonna tell me what's going on, or do I have to guess? He asked. Sarah pulled out the business card and slid it across to him. Pete read it, his eyebrows climbing. Holloway? As in Holloway Industries Holloway? He owns the diner, Pete. He's owned it for 6 months. Did you know? Pete nodded slowly. Yeah, I knew, was told to keep it quiet. New owner wanted to observe without people changing how they acted around him. Made sense at the time. He offered me a job, a real job, not waitressing. 200,000 a year plus benefits. Sarah's voice cracked on the number, and a $20,000 signing bonus. Pete let out a low whistle. That's life-changing money. That's what I keep thinking about. Mom's treatment, the debt, everything. It could all go away. I could actually breathe for the first time in years. But he set me up, Pete. He lied about who he was, tested me like I was some kind of experiment. How am I supposed to trust someone who starts a relationship with manipulation? Rich people play different games than the rest of us, Pete said thoughtfully. They have to. Can't ever be sure if people like them for who they are or what they have. Doesn't make it right. But I understand why he did it. Question is, was the job offer real, and do you believe you can do the work? Sarah thought about that. The work itself being a voice for communities, pushing back against development that hurt more than it helped. That was work she could believe in. That was work that mattered. But working for someone who'd already proven he was willing to manipulate her, that felt like stepping into a trap she couldn't see yet. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it out to see a text from her mother's nurse. Another update. Another complication. Another reminder of why she was working herself to exhaustion in the first place. The medical bills were mounting faster than she could count, and the collection calls were getting more aggressive. Time was running out. "What would you do?" she asked Pete. He considered the question for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "I'd take, but I'd also go in with my eyes open. You're smart, Sarah. Smarter than this job needs. And you've got principles, which is more than most people can say. Maybe he's manipulative, but he's also offering you a chance to use those principles on a scale that actually matters. You could help a lot of people in that job, including yourself." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She thought about her mother, about the conversation they'd had last week when the doctors had given them the latest prognosis. Her mother had held her hand and said, "I don't want you to sacrifice your life for mine. Promise me you'll take opportunities when they come." This was an opportunity. A complicated, morally ambiguous, possibly dangerous opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the lobby of Holloway Tower, a gleaming monument of glass and steel in the financial district that seemed to reach up and scrape the clouds. She wore a suit she'd bought at a discount store, nothing compared to the expensive attire of the people flowing around her, but it was clean and pressed, and made her feel slightly more prepared for whatever was about to happen. She'd called Marcus the night before, after hours of conversation with her mother, after reviewing the contract his lawyers had sent over, after doing her own research on Holloway Industries and finding that everything he'd told her appeared to be true. The company had a mixed reputation, aggressive in business, but surprisingly ethical in its community development projects, with several initiatives that actually seemed designed to help, rather than exploit. She'd accepted the job. The signing bonus had already been deposited into her account, a number so large she'd stared at her phone for 10 minutes just to make sure it was real. Her mother's next 3 months of treatment were paid for, the collection agencies had been satisfied, and for the first time in years, Sarah had felt something that might have been hope. Now, standing in this lobby, surrounded by wealth and power she'd never imagined having access to, that hope felt fragile and uncertain. The receptionist directed her to the 42nd floor, and Sarah rode the elevator up, with a dozen other people, all of them looking confident and purposeful, like they belonged in this world of expensive suits and strategic decisions. Marcus was waiting for her when the elevator doors opened, leaning against a glass wall with that same assessing expression he'd worn in the diner. But now, in his natural habitat, he seemed even more formidable. This was a man who built empires, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives, who operated on a level so far above her, it made her dizzy to think about. "You came," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I wasn't entirely sure you would. I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. "I'm still not sure this isn't a mistake. It might be, for both of us, but let's find out together." He led her through a maze of glass-walled conference rooms and open-plan offices, where people worked at standing desks with multiple monitors, everything sleek and modern and intimidating. They ended up in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire city, and Sarah could see the neighborhood where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life, small and distant from this height. "This is your office," Marcus said. "Your team is down the hall, 3 people to start with, all experienced in community development and urban planning. Your first project is that rezoning proposal we discussed. I want your honest assessment of what that neighborhood needs, and then I want you to work with the architects to design something that actually serves those needs. Budget is flexible, timeline is 6 months. Sarah turned from the window to look at him, searching his face for any sign that this was still some elaborate test, some game she didn't understand, but he just looked tired and sincere, like a man who genuinely wanted to do something good, and knew he needed help to do it. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire consultants with degrees and experience, and because they'd tell me what they think I want to hear. You won't. You proved that, and that's worth more than any degree." Marcus walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. There will be people in this company who resent you, who'll say you don't belong here, that you're unqualified. They're right in a way. You don't have the traditional credentials, but you have something they don't. You've lived the life of the people our projects are supposed to help. Don't let anyone take that away from you. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the city council, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her were the 300 families who would have been displaced by the original development proposal, and beside her were the architects and planners who'd helped her design something better. The plans spread across the table showed affordable housing units, integrated with a community health clinic, a fresh food market, a childcare center, and a park where kids could play safely. It was everything she'd told Marcus that morning in the diner, but real now, tangible, possible. The project had been brutal. She'd worked 16-hour days again, but this time it was different. She was building something instead of just surviving. There had been fights with the development team, who didn't understand why they couldn't just maximize profit. There had been compromises she'd hated making, times when she'd had to choose between perfect and possible, but the design in front of the council was something she could be proud of, something that would actually help people instead of pushing them out. Marcus sat in the back of the council chambers, watching but not interfering. That had been his style over the past 6 months. He'd given her resources and authority but let her make the decisions, stepping in only when she asked for help. They'd developed a strange working relationship, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that they were trying to do something good in a system designed to reward greed. The council voted unanimously to approve the project. When Sarah walked out of the chambers, she found Marcus waiting by his car. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Thank you for the opportunity." Sarah looked back at the building, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, the desperation that had made her vulnerable to his test, the integrity that had helped her pass it, the leap of faith that had brought her here. Her mother was still sick, the treatment buying time but not miracles. The medical bills were still crushing despite her new salary. Life wasn't fixed, wasn't perfect, wasn't the fairy tale that taking a billionaire's job offer might have seemed like from the outside. But she was making a difference now, real tangible change that would affect real people's lives. "I have another project for you," Marcus said, pulling out a folder. "A neighborhood in Chicago that's being targeted for gentrification. Similar situation, similar needs. Interested?" Sarah took the folder, flipping through photographs of aging buildings and struggling families, seeing her own past reflected in their present. She thought about the waitress she'd been 6 months ago, desperate and afraid, and convinced she'd never escape the trap of poverty. She thought about the person she was becoming, someone who could actually help people like her younger self, who could use her voice and her experience to create something better. "Yeah," she said, "I'm interested." They drove back to the office together, and through the car window, Sarah watched the city flow past, the wealthy neighborhoods and the struggling ones, the gleaming towers and the forgotten corners, all of it connected in ways most people never stopped to notice. She'd been tested and she'd passed, but the real test was just beginning. The test of staying true to herself in a world of compromise, of maintaining her integrity while navigating corporate politics, of remembering where she came from even as she moved forward into a future she never imagined possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Proud of you, baby girl. Always have been, always will be." Sarah smiled, slipping the phone back into her pocket. The envelope of money had been life-changing, but not in the way Marcus had initially intended. It hadn't bought her voice, it had amplified it, and she was just getting started.